Our speakers tonight are Dr. Brendan Looyenga and Mr. Ben Rao. Probably all of you know them, but we'll have a little introduction here. Mr. Ben Rao attends Faith PRC with his wife Brenda and their 6 children, all in elementary school. Ben is the software engineering manager at Vibration Research and brings over a decade of experience in developing cloud platforms, Internet of Things solutions, and artificial intelligence software, having previously worked at Amway and Twist Think. And Dr. Brendan Looyenga also attends Faith Church with his wife Kelly, and they have 5 children, 3 married and 2 currently in high school. He is a research and development scientist at Empirical Bioscience and formerly served as a professor of biochemistry at Calvin University for 8 years. Both men bring a unique perspective to the field of artificial intelligence, and we are thankful for their willingness to share this with us today. Their title for their presentation is Intelligence or Illusion? Christian Perspective on Artificial Intelligence. We welcome the men.
Kind introduction, Michael. As you all heard, the person in the room who has far more knowledge about this topic is the man who's presenting with me tonight, so I'm thankful for that and very much appreciated the invitation to speak tonight. If you were watching the montage of clips from the media that was up on the screen to open up this evening, you'll know that artificial intelligence is everywhere around us. You can hardly avoid it if you tried, whether it's in the news, whether it's in your day-to-day work, or whether it's just something that you hear about watching the news at night, you can't avoid it. The thing is, the voices that speak to this topic are very, very broad. Some will tell you that we're having an existential crisis and the world is going to come to an end because of artificial intelligence. And other people are lauding it as one of the greatest inventions of all time that's going to revolutionize humanity and take us to the next level. And of course, what we need to understand is that the truth is somewhere in the middle, as always. And how do we view this, particularly through the lens of Scripture and as Christians? And I think that's our primary interest tonight, is not to try and cover every possible aspect in the topic of artificial intelligence. It really would be impossible to do that. But to start providing a framework to think about it as a unique technology, to understand areas of particular concern and use, and then think through some of the problems that might be associated with its use in those areas. So really 4 sections tonight. I'm going to open up very briefly with an introduction that starts broad, because like all technologies that have revolutionized our world, there is a biblical Christian perspective to it. There always is. And what is the truth, too, is that that perspective is something that we can take and apply to any technology. So we'll start with that, engaging with technology from a broad perspective to start the evening. After that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Ben, and he's going to spend some time talking through AI, what it is, generally how it works, and how these applications find their uses today. After that, I'll come back and talk a little bit about some guiding principles, particularly biblical principles to draw on, and then together we'll present the last section on some practical implications for various areas of life. I also want to point out that this framework is not arbitrary, and neither is the passage that was used to open up this evening from Proverbs. Throughout the book of Proverbs, you'll notice over and over recurring references to the themes of knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And those 3 terms are not simply synonyms one of another, but they actually form a continuum in the Christian life. And this can be applied to really any technology that we engage with. One of the first things that we need to do is simply understand that technology. And what I mean by that is have a knowledge of how it works, what it does, and what are some of the things we need to be concerned about. Once we understand something from the knowledge point of view, that is, we have the facts about it. What we need to do is apply to it a biblical perspective. What does God say about our use of this technology, and what are some of the biblical principles that we can apply specifically to its use? When the Bible uses the word understanding, that's the idea, is what is God's perspective on something? And that naturally flows into the third term, wisdom, which is how do I live knowing what God's perspective and what principles God has given for this technology. So again, this continuum really can be used in any technology that we engage with. First, know it, understand what God's perspective on it is, and then finally, how do I apply it and live out of that biblical understanding? So that's the framework that we're going to use tonight. Now, before we get into more detail specifically about artificial intelligence, I just want to point out that we can engage with any technology answering 4 basic questions, or at least asking those questions and trying to glean answers from them. And I've learned out throughout the years, following ways that Professor Gritters likes to lead out his presentations, to do it with words that hopefully will stick. So 4 P words. The first question is purpose. Purpose. Why was this technology created? And what was the intent behind it? That's the idea behind purpose. And why something was created is going to tell us something about how it's going to be implied in society as well. The next question is provenance. Provenance. And if anybody is familiar with the art world, when we talk about provenance, it's the history and the foundation of something. So when we talk about the provenance of a technology, what we're saying is, what are the underlying foundations that make this technology work? What is it built on? Next is the question of potential. So I think we would all agree that the paperclip is an invention that we all use, and nuclear technology is also a technology that we've all been affected by. But the difference in magnitude between a paperclip and a nuclear technology should be fairly obvious. They're both technologies, but their potential is quite different. So when we think about this question, we need to be thinking about how can a technology be used and what's the magnitude of its impact. And like any technology, the greater the magnitude, the more good it could do, but also there's an amplification of the evil that can be done with it. So we need to be thinking about that in the context of artificial intelligence too. And then the last point, pitfalls. All right, pitfalls. What are the things that come as a result of this technology that may not have been intended by the inventors? In the AI world, the word sub-goals is oftentimes used, and I'll refer back to that a little bit later. But what are some of the things that occur as an effect of using AI that maybe weren't intended? And thinking through those and trying to be ahead of the ball game so that we can think of them and avoid those pitfalls ahead of time is really important. So as you go through the material tonight, and as Ben goes through it, keep these 4 points in mind. What is the purpose behind artificial intelligence? What is it built on? And we're going to spend quite a bit of time on that because that's a really important point. What is it built on? What's the provenance? What kind of potential does it have to shape our society? And then finally, what are some of the pitfalls that we need to be aware of? All right, I'm going to turn the floor over to Ben, and he's now going to introduce the technology itself and give you hopefully some knowledge behind how artificial intelligence works.
Thank you, Brendan. Similarly to Brendan, I was excited by the opportunity to have a co-presenter for this topic tonight, and I think the idea of working through the content and developing together has certainly led to a better product in terms of what we're able to share with you as we've developed these concepts together. So as we start looking at AI, really 3 introductory comments before we dive into the material. First being, I'll probably attribute my invitation to speak less to deep competence in AI and more the collusion of board members from the RFPA who happen to be related to me or work with me. At the same time, though, working in the field of technology has advantages, and you can use those in terms of trying to make this topic more accessible. On that same note, when you look at AI, there certainly will be probably folks in the audience tonight who have a lot of technology depth and could probably speak at this at more depth even than I could. Yet at the same time, there's also some here tonight who have very little AI exposure, and our goal is to thread the middle of that and make this a conversation that gives everyone some level of insight along with some applications and knowledge. So with that, we'll dive in. When we think about AI, really it's important to start with definitions, clear terminology, a sense of history, where this came from. And we'll start by defining AI, and a good working definition is when a technology or machine exhibits characteristics that you typically would attribute to a human. The ability to reason, the ability to learn, the ability to give guidance. And you can tell this is a very broad definition. And you could almost think of AI, I've heard someone describe AI as an umbrella term, like you might say the word furniture. Someone says, we're going to put furniture in this room, and the immediate follow-up question is, what kind of furniture? Tables, chairs, dining room, what might it be? And so you hear AI, think about diving deeper and understanding what kind of AI, what type of application. Always think about it from that perspective. But it's going to show these characteristics, and so you can recognize AI by the appearance of these things. And we'll give examples as we go tonight, and we'll break this down further, but that's a good working definition. Why is AI everywhere right now? I'll give a few reasons that from my perspective would stick. One is the fact that there's been incredible technological progress in the last 3 years, incredible advancements in the technology. That's certainly a reason that it's on people's minds, it's in the news, it seems to be everywhere. The second reason would be potential. When you look ahead and you say, where's this technology going? How disruptive will it be to education, to the workplace, to these other areas? There's a strong degree of potential impact in AI as it continues to roll out and advance. And then the third is a word maybe more broadly that I'd use called investment. And certainly there you can think about investment of time and energy. There's a lot of time and energy going into news cycle coverage, get people following this topic, being very interested in this topic. But it's also an area of financial investment as firms try to win the AI race and as companies try to win in the market by bringing AI into what they may offer. So there's a lot of reasons, I guess is what I'm trying to establish, that you're hearing a lot about AI in the world right now. It's not just fluff, it's not just a parlor trick. There's things that AI is starting to be able to do. So let's develop the concept a little further by looking at a distinction between two types of AI. And I'll put some screenshots up here for those in the back. I guess this is what you get for not sitting closer to the front. The intent isn't the detail of these screenshots, these are working examples. And I'm going to start by talking about traditional AI. When I say traditional AI, what I'm distinguishing from is the next type, generative AI. And traditional AI shows up in things like Google Translate, where we've seen the ability for translation, what in the past would have been a human job, to be done by a machine. It's very capable of taking language, saying, oh, that looks like Dutch, that looks like German, and here's a translation I'd recommend. You see it show up in Alexa and Siri, and the ability to converse with these digital voice assistants where they understand what you're saying and can do something with that. You also see it show up in text-to-speech on your phone or in product recommendations. How many times have you been online shopping for something and you see a list of recommended products? That's an AI agent, that's traditional AI, that's taking your browsing history, taking things that can ascertain about you, and giving you recommendations. And perhaps the best example of traditional AI would be your social media feed. If you're a social media user, the content that's pushed to you is coming because of an algorithm. And that's the lead-in to really how to think about traditional AI is an algorithm, a complex set of concepts that have been trained, specialized logic, that's good at doing a very specific job. And this is where the example that I have here of Deep Blue, if you remember in the 80s and 90s, there was an IBM trained computer that played chess against a world grandmaster, Garry Kasparov. It was trained very specifically and optimized for that job of playing chess by looking at years of chess match history, looking at what moves one matches, and training itself on it. And so when you think about traditional AI, think about the analogy of driving through a gravel area hundreds and hundreds of times and wearing grooves into a road. And when you follow that road and follow that path, the grooves get worn deeper and deeper. Traditional AI works like that. The grooves are worn deep through repetition, through training, and that makes it very capable of accomplishing certain tasks. There's great cost, there's great preparation, and there's a great degree of knowledge required to train on traditional AI, and yet there's also great power. And when you think about these examples of use cases of traditional AI, what you'll see is that these aren't all new from the last 3 years. These are technologies that have emerged over the last decades. As the internet and as cell phones and as other technologies advanced, AI has been there. It's just been a bit more silent, a bit less unobtrusive, and it's been taking on these forms and growing in these ways. So that's traditional AI. And that's in contrast to generative AI. And if someone said AI in the last month, year, 3 years, they're probably talking about generative AI. This is where you hear words like ChatGPT, Grok, Claude, all these assistants, these digital platforms. And here are a few examples. You can see Claude on the top right. You can see ChatGPT on the bottom right. Those are both chat-based generative AI tools, where you have a conversation, you ask a question, you seek specific instructions, and the AI handles those things. Other examples would be if you've upgraded your Apple iPhone recently and now you have Apple Intelligence, you get text summaries. And that's an AI model that's on your phone that's looking at your messages and saying, you don't have time to read all those, I'll distill those down to this brief summary, which sometimes is fairly accurate, other times less accurate. And last of all, if you've searched in Google in the last few months, maybe even years, you'll start to see AI summaries appearing at the top. And what that is Google saying, yes, I could search and I could give you results, and you'll get to those if you keep scrolling, but here's what you really need to know. It's a summarization technique that bubbles that information up in front of you. And so even if you haven't chosen to use generative AI, you're going to run into it, you're going to see it show in these different places, in tools, and in technologies you're already using. So what's different about generative AI? A few things. Really a key concept when you think about generative AI is the idea of a large language model. So if traditional AI was trained for very specific jobs, very specific purposes, and optimized its capabilities there, think of large language models as generalists. They're trained on massive data sets that they've curated from the internet, and that's not just text, that's images, that's videos. You see generative AI able to generate different things. That's because of data sets that they've pulled in over the years from the internet. In some cases, data sets they're allowed to pull in. In other cases, data sets that they've now been legislated against for pulling in, like public news articles, for instance. And those things have been brought into these large language models to make them very effective generalists. And this is where the advancements in the power of AI has come in the last few years, when you've probably been surprised if you've played with these tools to see it give a decent response to a question you asked and seem to know things that you wouldn't have expected an AI tool to know. It's pulling things off the internet, and it's making predictions. Models have advanced very quickly, and now even include the ability to appear to reason, where it won't just immediately answer your question, but it will think about how to tackle a specific problem, and it will then reason its way through, here's how I'm going to try to answer what you're putting to me as a question. So this distinction matters because traditional AI, as I mentioned, and now generative AI, which is capturing all the hype. And a lot of what we'll focus on tonight is really this generative AI lane, because that's where the advancements have been, and that's where a lot of the additional kind of investment will be in the next years as we look ahead. So how do we get here? And I think it's important maybe to look back a minute and talk about some of this history. We'll keep this brief because we want to keep moving into more applications. But you could really separate the history of AI into 4 eras. Again, the text may be a bit small for those in the back, but we'll try and work through these and take you on the journey. And the term AI first came in the 1950s. And this was a time when futurists were looking ahead. They were thinking about this idea of what if I could interface with a computer? The idea of computers was fairly new. The power of computers was fairly limited. What if that could interface with me like a human? And really more conceptual, more early, the kind of thing a futurist would be interested in, but not something that the average person would interact with. And that really lasted, you could call that an AI winter, all the way to the 90s. As the internet launched and as technology advanced, in the 2000s to 2010s was a period where you saw ubiquitous high-speed internet. That was everywhere. You saw cell phones emerge. You saw the online ecosystem start to emerge, and that paved the way then for the AI technologies that I've talked about to start to roll out, more traditional AI. In the 2020 to 2025 timeframe is really where the technology foundations for tools like ChatGPT were built, began to be rolled out, and began to be advanced. And then incredible evolution of technology year on year as it's hard to keep up even with the amount of new models introduced and the amount of things that are coming. And so what will happen in the future? Obviously a wide variety of projections, as Brendan mentioned. There's some on this side who may say, this is the future. Soon in years, we won't even need to work. AI will be handling all these things. Others saying it's all hype. And again, truth certainly falls in the middle. But what is certain is that we're coming through a curve where there's been a lot of advancement and adoption, And now things like regulation, legislation, accountability, and governance will certainly start to apply more and more to these tools. So that's a very brief AI history lesson. Again, just kind of keep ourselves grounded here on how we got to this point. As we close out this section, I want to take just a couple slides to talk about how generative AI works, right? And again, here we've talked about the technology very broadly and given you some ways to identify what it does, what it's capable of, what's happening under the hood, having a level of knowledge around the process flow that actually happens here hopefully gives a little more intelligence into how do I think about this tool. So, interacting with AI. Really, it starts with AI getting input from you as a user. And typically, if you're in ChatGPT, that's through typing. You're typing something in. If you're using a tool like Siri or Hey Google, as Prof. Gritters demonstrated a few weeks ago in the convocation speech, that might come in through voice, but it translates down to text in terms of how that comes to the AI assistant. There's always context, right? Think about digital footprints when you engage with platforms online. It knows things about you. It's looking at your history. It's looking at who you are. If you've used the service before, it has that context to draw on. Context is always part of the equation when you use tools. And think about that and have awareness around that. But what have I asked for? What's my prompt? What context do I know about you? Perhaps you've given additional context that says, I'm in this role. For instance, if I'm working on something using an AI tool for the Heritage Foundation, I might say, I'm working for a nonprofit that supports a school as a fundraiser activity. I'll give context so that AI can give me a better response. AI may, in some cases, immediately be able to respond to your question. If your question is a factual question, like how tall is Mount Sinai, you'll get a very quick, instant response because that's a fact that's been trained in. AI knows right where to go and look for that. There's other times where you're asking about something, and this is where we've seen advancement in AI over the last few years, where now there's more sophisticated capabilities to say, this is a real-time question that desires a real-time answer. What's the current score of the Michigan game? And AI now knows to go and search the open internet for that question. It doesn't know the answer, but it knows how to connect you to the answer and pull that information in real time. There's other times where you've asked AI to do something, to plan something, and it's going to take more of a reasoning-based approach. And so think of it as trying to decide on the right strategy to take to answer the specific question you've asked. It's important to stop and also realize that before AI responds, there's mediation that happens, there's guardrails. And so the tools have things they're not allowed to give answers on. They're not allowed to give answers on how to build a bomb. They're not allowed to give answers to questions that may be prejudiced or go down a specific path that the makers of these tools have said, that's off limits. There's a layer of control and of mediation that sits in these services. And that's an important thing to remember. Brendan will unpack this a bit more in his next section. What you need to realize is that it's not just a straight, direct line between these services and the large language model. There's a level of control and design that's been intentionally built in. And that can include things like, how personal will I be as an LLM in answering your question? Will I call you by your name? Will I be kind to you? Or will I be more cold and factual in my response? You need to realize those are knobs that can be turned in the technology by the makers of these technologies to accomplish their goals. AI then responds to the user, stores the conversation history for future use and training. And this idea of context comes in here. When you've had a conversation with an AI assistant, it's bringing that in and storing that so that future interactions, as the makers of these tools would say, can be improved. So with that in mind, and with that just very brief view of how does this process work and what's happening, let's pause for just a couple reflections. First, does AI truly know things? And this is an important question because if we have these models that have been trained on massive internet data sets, how does AI know what to respond to you and how does it understand these things? And the important thing is really to realize that these are prediction engines. I'm sure you've seen humorous examples of AI getting very basic math problems wrong, missing questions like how many R's are in the word strawberry, and it says 3, right? AI doesn't know things. It's a very sophisticated prediction engine. I think the answer is this. I think the answer is that. And so there's less intentional design to be able to answer whatever questions you might ask, and it's looking across what it's been trained on and saying, I think this is the answer. But that's put forward as truth. It's important to know, too, that this question, when you think about will AI tell you when it doesn't know something, these tools are optimized to have you keep using them and to project confidence in using them. And so AI will not admit when it doesn't know something. There were times a few years ago where you'd run into that at times. When you interact with AI today, what you'll see more frequently is AI very boldly proclaim, this is the answer. And if you confront it and say, that's not the answer because I happen to know that that's not the answer, it will apologize profusely and self-correct. But it's on you, as the user of these tools, to hold the tool accountable. It will not be honest with you in terms of what it knows and doesn't know, unless very directly asked. How is AI different than a Google search? We've all used Google. You type in a search query, you see a long list of possibilities. Google builds what it shows you based on who's gone to sites before and builds credibility based on that. But it leaves it to you to synthesize the information and form your own conclusions. You might look at 3 or 4 sources. If you've been trained well in doing research by teachers, by professors, you'll consult multiple sources and you'll synthesize the information. When you use AI, the experience differs in that it will say, here's the answer, and it will present it to you as a answer, perhaps a set of possibilities if you ask the question in the right way, but it brings you right to that solution. And then lastly, an important question is, are these AI responses, or the things you're getting back from AI, neutral? And here we've talked about how mediation happens in the middle, how the makers of these tools and platforms control how they act with you and how they respond to you and how they might bring information back to you. And there's been great testing done on this. There's a reading list. I don't know if that's sitting in the back or where that is, but there's a very recent article done by the Gospel Coalition where they asked questions from the Christian faith perspective of 7 different chatbot engines. Great article, and it deeply explores this question of neutrality and shows that there's a degree of influence where the makers of these platforms in different cases will guide responses one direction or another. And so you ought to use these tools with the assumption that there isn't neutrality built in, but whatever particular leanings, agenda the tool makers may have in place. So that's a broad overview of AI as a technology, starting with definitions, moving into a contrast between types, and then diving a touch deeper into how these technologies work. With that, I'll transition back to Brendan, and he will talk a bit about some guiding principles and understanding in terms of using AI.
All right, so the second main section on understanding is going to be a little different approach. I want to start out, though, kind of where Ben ended on this question of neutrality. And I think the statement that's made up here is something that we've all run across in one way or another because we interact with technologies all the time. And that statement is this: inventions in and of themselves aren't good or bad, they're neutral. And the secondary implication of that, of course, is it's how you use them that provides the moral weight, okay? So again, going back to that idea of nuclear technology, I can use that nuclear technology to power a city's power grid or make a bomb. 2 very different moral equations. So that's the idea. The technology is neutral, how you use it matters. And those who want to continue to use this idea from a Christian perspective will oftentimes turn to 1 Timothy 4, where they'll say, well, every creature of God, creatures like technology, are good and nothing to be refused if it be received with thanksgiving. So again, the idea behind this is, well, we can use AI, we just need to know how we're using it. And while I'm not here telling you you may or may not use artificial intelligence, I think that the question here is a little bit more difficult. And the reason being the fact that there's more under the hood than simply a technology when you begin to interact with it. So let me explain that. I want to use the terms that I opened up this speech with tonight, this idea of purpose, provenance, and then pitfalls. Those are the 3 I'll talk about here. So first off, what is AI built to do? Why was it invented? And again, if you ask many of the different inventors who were involved in creating the software and the technology, they'll give you their personal perspective on why they did it. Sometimes they're wildly sort of crazy reasons why they did it. But the basic underlying theme of why this technology was created was to make us more efficient. It's really important to realize that. This technology is about efficiency. It can take what may have took many, many days to do in the past and accomplish it in just moments. So again, it's an increase in efficiency. That's the underlying purpose. Now, I'm going to get into this more later when we talk about artificial intelligence in the context of education, but you probably right away realize that making efficiency the one goal oftentimes competes with other things that we're trying to accomplish. And this is going to be particularly true when it comes to the area of education. Just because you can do something really quickly does not mean that you're accomplishing the other underlying goals. So again, be careful with that. Even more important, I think, really is the provenance. And remember, I had said that's the underlying foundations, where this technology came from. And a former colleague of mine from Calvin College, who I've always appreciated, Derek Sherman, was a professor of computer science at Calvin, wrote an article just a couple of months after ChatGPT was first brought out. So this was the end of 2022. And he wrote a very nice article in Christian Scholars Review called ChatGPT and the Rise of AI. And he made many different observations in there that were valuable. Again, that's on the reading list that Ben referred to. But one of the statements he made in there that really caught my attention is this. He said, technology is not neutral, and neither are the algorithms and training data used in AI. And that really got me thinking about this because those two components, training data and algorithms, are what make this technology not neutral. Let me explain that in a moment. First of all, the training data. Ben already referred to this. The training data behind generative AI are these large language models. And most of that language that's being used as training data is simply a conglomeration of internet data. So if you think of all of the text of web pages that have been published over the past decades, all of that becomes the background information that feeds into how these softwares think. Take a moment to think about that. How many times have you gone on the internet and found something that's just flat out wrong, something that's morally wrong, or something that just is something you can't understand or deal with and doesn't have an answer? There is so much of that, because it's opinion that's on the internet, that when you use that as training data, remember, these softwares are being built to think based on that data. Now, the different kinds of chatbots, as they're called, or AI agents, utilize that information in different ways. But the way they absorb that information and weight it will help explain the answers that they're giving to you. I've heard and seen statistics that suggest that up to 70% of the data that's used to train certain AI platforms is user-generated. So think of texts, think of websites like Reddit and Quora, where it's simply a big chat board where people put their opinions out there. This is the underlying scaffold of large language models, just what's out there on the internet. Okay? So the extent to which you trust internet information in your day-to-day search for knowledge and truth ought to be the level of confidence that you have in AI. And I think we ought to be cautious about that. But it's not just the training data that makes things questionable. It's also a process known as alignment, and that's where this algorithms comes in. And again, Ben introduced that term earlier. The algorithms essentially are the computer programs, the logic behind how data is used and deployed to give you an answer or to help solve a problem. Now, alignment is a process that all artificial intelligence platforms have to use in order to decide what's right and what's wrong from contrasting information on the internet, and what things they want to tell and don't want to tell. So for instance, Ben had referred to this idea of making a bomb. If you went onto one of these chat platforms and asked, how do I make a weapon of mass destruction, you aren't going to get an answer. It's not because that information isn't out there on the internet, but the alignment process that these companies have used basically scrubs those answers because of the moral dubiousness of what that answer would give you. The problem you should see right away with that, though, is something that I consider morally questionable and another person does is going to differ greatly based on our values. And as you might suspect, the algorithms and the alignment process behind these artificial intelligence softwares is not fundamentally based on Scripture. So remember that. There's always going to be a strong, heavy bias behind the answers that you receive and the output. This becomes very concerning in certain areas. Ben will get into this later when you think about companion AIs, artificial intelligence that's built to act like a friend to you. The advice and the information that you get is not going to be aligned with Scripture or the Christian faith. So great caution in those areas needs to be exercised. And then finally, just briefly on pitfalls, I think many different things can be spoken of here. The list could probably go on and on. There are a lot of unintended consequences, and we'll point to some of those a little bit later in the third section. But one of the things I want to particularly point out here is this idea of sub-goals. And that's a term that's oftentimes used in AI when an AI agent is given a task and said, go accomplish this. And the way that the underlying algorithms work is to essentially create a score. When that task is fulfilled, essentially points are given, so to speak, to that AI agent to reinforce what it's doing and make it better. So one of the examples that's been used in this is that you can give a video game to an AI agent and simply tell that AI agent, figure out how to win this. And it will simply play that game over and over and over and over again until it figures out the right strategies that will get to that goal as quickly as possible. One of the concerns, of course, here is that if you start using artificial intelligence in the real world, not a game now, and you tell an artificial intelligence to go accomplish a task, let's say it's being used with military hardware, and part of that is killing the enemy, you can imagine a lot of the concerns that come with it. If points are for achieving that and you try to stop it, what's it going to do to you? These are concerns that have been brought up, and again, they're not a reality at this point, but these sub-goals can't always be predicted ahead of time. So when you give or let loose AI in a certain task, be concerned about what it might do instead. All right? So again, just a beginning, but something to be concerned about when it comes to AI. Now, in the next 3 slides, I want to just very briefly touch on 3 areas of Christian doctrine that ought to keep us aware and thinking about this technology. The first is the image of God. As we know from the first book of the Bible, the very first chapter of the Bible, the image of God is a gift uniquely given to humankind, to men and women, not to any other creature. And we also know from the Reformed confessions, based on Scripture, that the content of the image of God is true knowledge, righteousness, and holiness. And yet the reason why other creatures can't bear that image is because God gave unique capacities to humankind to be able to bear that image. And again, if you've heard other Reformed speakers from our denomination speak on this, the idea is that the image is the precious stone in the ring, and the ring itself and the setting of the ring are those capacities that can bear that image. All right? Now, some of the capacities that we think about with image bearing that are unique to humans are things like the ability to communicate, rationality, creativity, the ability to analyze a problem and look for a solution. All right? And one of the things that really should be striking and has hit a lot of people, many different Christian commentators who have been thinking about AI, is how strange it is that we would go and build something that essentially has all of the capacities. It's very odd. And the parallel that's often drawn is actually to idolatry. So if you think back, especially to the ancient world and to the various idol gods that are talked about in the Old Testament and elsewhere, one of the things we realize about them is that they're all anthropomorphic. They're built or made to look like a person. Again, Psalm 115 refers to that, talking about idols of silver and gold, the work of men's hands, they that make them are like unto them. And the reverse is true too. Idols are made in the image of man. It's essentially worshiping self and imposing that on God or a deity. This particular point was one of the central focus is of Stephen Driscoll in a really good book. If you're interested in a nice Christian perspective in AI, this is a recent book called Made in Our Image. And he makes a quote in there and says, AI is the most incredibly complex computational mirror. We can see ourselves in its reflection, and it shows us our deepest values and mirrors our basest actions. And again, there is a sense in which it's very, very easy for a technology that's as powerful and immersive as AI to become a focus, so much so that it becomes something that we worship. We let it take over our lives, and it displaces so many of the other things in our lives, including our worship of God. We ought to be very, very careful about this, and the fact that the capacities built into AI look an awful lot like the things attributed to idols ought to make us think twice about our use. Another very important biblical concept that's oftentimes talked about in the context of AI is the idea of stewardship. And I want to just briefly point out there are three things that we can say about stewards. All right? First of all is stewards don't own, they manage on the behalf of another. All right? Stewards manage, they don't own. Secondarily, any steward is accountable to his master. He's not an independent agent. He doesn't work on his own. They are accountable. And third, the calling of a steward is to serve the interests not of himself, but of his master. Now, if we think about this in the context of AI, it's very important to realize that there's a great danger in the use of AI in offloading our tasks, our responsibilities, and our abilities to a software that essentially we quit cultivating our own abilities. That's one part of the equation. There's a real risk of being a poor steward of what God has given unto us because we're simply offloading it to AI. And again, the parable in Matthew 25 about the stewards is important here. What God gives and we don't use, he'll take away. But the flip side to that is there's also a significant calling that if we are going to use AI, like any technology, it must be in a God-honoring way. There's a very nice article in the flagship magazine of the PCA by two men. The magazine is called By Faith. And again, it's a reference to artificial intelligence. And they make the point that the dominion that humans exercise is not absolute, but it's derivative. That means it comes from somewhere, and we're accountable to God. We're not the ultimate rulers of creation, Christ is, and therefore our development and use of AI must always be conducted in a way that, or in submission to his will. So again, the two sides to stewardship. Don't give up the calling to cultivate your own gifts and abilities. And any way that you do use this technology needs to be in a way that's consistent with the other virtues of the Christian faith that we're called to in Scripture. Last, I want to bring up this concept of conscientious abstinence. And again, this isn't formally terminology that comes out of the Bible, but it's a concept derived from principles in Scripture. And what conscientious abstinence is the intentional choice to abstain from the use of something, whether it's a good or a technology, for the spiritual good of oneself or for others. And we can think of many different examples of this in Scripture. Paul talks about it. He says, all things are lawful for me, so I may, but not all things are expedient. Not all things are good for me. Just because it's there and it's in the creation doesn't mean it's best for me to use it. All things are lawful, but not everything edifies. So keep that in mind when we think about various places in Scripture where there are things that are Christian liberties that the writers of Scripture say, but be careful with how you use them because you could be hurting someone or yourself by their use. Great examples of these include things like food offers to idols. Right? Paul talks about that multiple times. Were you permitted as a Christian to eat that food? Sure. But if you were doing it in a way that offended someone who was a recent convert from paganism, Paul's advice was, don't do it. You're going to cause harm to that person. The same thing with alcohol is another great example. May we have a drink? Yes. But there are places and times where there's going to be offense or one needs to know their own weakness. Again, conscientious abstinence may say at times, I'm going to abstain for the good of others or myself. great example of this was the Saint Jonadab, the Rechabite, who's mentioned in the book of Jeremiah. God told Jeremiah to go to his later descendants and essentially use them as examples to the Jewish nation for their faithfulness. And interestingly, the faithfulness that they were observing was the command of their father Jonadab, who was around about the time of Ahab, was involved with killing off the Baal worshipers in Israel. From that time on, he told his family, we're not going to consume alcohol. And we're not going to do that ostensibly because of the temptation that it brings to our family. We're not going to do that. Now, that's not a broad scriptural prohibition on all alcohol use, but out of conscientious abstinence, Jonadab said, we're not going to do that. And I think that this is something we need to keep in mind. Artificial intelligence may be everywhere, and it may be something that's unavoidable for us in some ways, but that doesn't mean that we have to use it in every possible instance. Prof. Gritters gave a very nice example of a place where it certainly ought not to be used in the preparation of sermons by a Reformed pastor. That's one. But there are many others. And I think, again, Stephen Driscoll makes a good point. At some way, we're going to have to decide how to use it, and we may decide to act counterculturally, that is, by restricting AI or even excluding it from our lives. Think about that, especially for those of you who are parents and have children at home who are in a tender age and going through their education and have to spend time doing the research and the work that involves a computer. There is an enormous temptation to misuse that technology to short-circuit the process of education. Think about that as parents, and think about how abstaining in certain ways may be good for the benefit of your family. Okay? Now, this is not intended to be an exhaustive list of principles. There are many others that can be pointed to. Some of the reading material that's on the reading list that we suggested could help point you in other directions. This just gives you a sense of some of the moral weight in considering this technology. I'm going to transition now into the last section. I'm going to start it out and talk a little bit about education. And then Ben is going to finish things up and talk about AI in the workplace, and also in this area of guidance and connection. He'll explain what that means when we get there. Now, I just want to be clear. I'm not expecting anybody to be able to read this figure. That's not the point. This is simply one of the graphics that came out of a really fantastic article that was actually pointed out to me by, I think it was our principal at Adams. Mr. Rick Binnerink actually handed this off to me, this article from World Magazine. It was a really nice reflection on AI in the context of education. It had some really nice research behind it, including this figure right here. Let me just distill it down for you just for a moment. What this figure is representing is essentially a bar graph of the different ways that students are using artificial intelligence in the education process today. And really, you can break it down into three areas. The first of those is information extraction, or another way of saying that is to do their research. Think about a Google query. You put in a question into Google, and it spits back a very nice distilled answer for you that a couple of years ago would have required reading several web pages, and back, at least when my generation was in school, would have required you to go to the encyclopedias and start looking things up. Okay? So again, the amount of time that's required to do research is infinitesimal compared to what it used to be. And again, students are using it for that. Now, does that mean it's wrong? It's not what I'm saying. But again, even now, some caution ought to be exercised, right? Is it always the best for a student to get that information right away? The answer is maybe not. Maybe working for it is going to help it stick better. The next of these is process simplification, and this is where we start getting into a lot more gray area, which is this idea of using artificial intelligence to just make things easier. Many of these platforms can answer questions that are part of the educational process, whether it's math, science, chemistry, pick your discipline. You can ask a question and receive not only the right answer, but the entire workflow of how to get to that answer. It's becoming increasingly difficult for teachers to actually be able to decipher whether a student is cheating or not until you get to the point where you take the test and the kid's homework was fantastic, but they don't have the foggiest idea of what's going on. It's pretty clear that they probably didn't do that work themselves. But that's a real problem in education. The last category is one that's perhaps even a greater concern, and that's the area of creative expression. Remember that these AI platforms are large language models. They're especially built to deal in language and communication. And they're exceptionally good at crafting a very beautiful response to any sort of prompt you give it. In fact, not only are they good at giving you a response, you can even tell them how long, what you'd like in it, and what kind of perspective you'd like. Again, Prof. Bitters talked about this a couple of weeks ago. You can say, generate a Reformed sermon about 2 to 3 pages long on this topic from the perspective of pick your favorite Reformed source, and it will give it to you. But that creative expression, of course, is not coming from the student. They're not doing the work. And I think the problem there is really summed up very nicely by Brad East, who was one of the people who was interviewed for this article. He's from Abilene Christian University, and he said, ChatGPT cannot give you, and again, he's referring to critical thinking skills, any more than a robot that picks you up and runs a mile can develop your mile running muscles for you. You have to do the running. So in the context of education, there's a lot of danger. And I want to refer also to an excellent book. Again, this book was written before the AI boom over the last few years by Nicholas Carr. But in this book, he makes some very, very good points about learning. And I think we ought to take these to heart. What we're being trained with, what we're using to learn, shapes how our minds work. This book was very much focused on the internet, but these concerns are amplified in the context of artificial intelligence. If you don't do the work, the ability to do it will never be developed, plain and simple. If you don't read a novel, if you don't read an extended argument or a extended logic on a topic of theology, you won't be able to do it either. If all you ever train yourself on is 140 characters in a snippet on X, or single pages of text on an internet site, and that's all the more you ever do, you won't be able to read a book anymore. You may not be able to listen to a sermon either. Your brain simply isn't wired to do it. So again, that ought to come as a pretty big caution to us in the area of education. If we're not teaching our children how to do things, they simply won't learn, okay? Shortcutting the process stunts that capacity. I'll just give you an example. Probably 2/3 of the audience, if I'm judging right, knows what both of these things are. Anybody who's maybe 10 years younger than me probably doesn't even know what the other thing is. So that's a slide rule. And in my parents' generation, kids who are doing math received this revolutionary device toward the end of high school called a slide rule that allowed them to do their math much, much more quickly and not have to have things memorized. It sped up the process. Jump forward 25 years, my generation, the calculator. What it used to take a long time to do by hand can be done in seconds with a calculator. But remember how these tools are used in education. We do not give our second graders calculators, at least I certainly hope we don't. Why? They'll never learn how to do addition and subtraction or multiplication or division or anything else if you simply give them the tool. They'll never learn it. AI is a far more powerful tool than either of those, and if you give it to children, they will use it, and they'll never figure out the skill behind it. It simply won't happen. So again, back to the underlying goal of artificial intelligence. It's about efficiency. Education is not about efficiency. In fact, efficiency militates against education. If we simply let our students do things as quickly as they possibly can, they won't actually learn how to do it. So this is a warning for all of us involved in education and as parents. Be careful, because these tools can do a lot of things for you, but it means you never will. And that ought to be a pretty significant caution. I'm going to turn the floor over to Ben now, and he's going to talk about context of the workplace and human interactions.
Thanks, Brendan. Mindful of our time, we'll try and move quickly through these next sections and be sure you can proceed on to the rest of the meeting. But if you think about a context where there's efficiency as a dominating principle, you probably think about the workplace. And so it's no surprise that in the context of work, in the world of work, AI certainly has transformative potential that seems to be coming. And a couple quotes here, right? One would be, from a very biased insider in the tech industry, the CEO of Google, who said that AI is more transformative than two technologies that are quite foundational, electricity and fire. And so that represents perhaps an extreme perspective, but a perspective that certainly you will hear in technology circles, and you'll hear applied to the future of work. A more balanced perspective might be what you hear from the former CEO of IBM, who said, AI may or may not be coming for your job, but someone who uses AI to a greater degree of effectiveness certainly is. And I think that that's probably a more balanced perspective when you think about the world of work, and you think about how efficiency and use of these tools may give someone an advantage in the work that they do, or a competitive advantage to a company in what they're trying to deliver to the marketplace in a capitalistic society. So if we want to assess what's the transformative potential of AI on the workplace, I think a couple helpful graphs come from a study done by Oxford Economics and Cognizant, which is a global consulting company. In the specific detail and scale of these graphs, you can see them going up and to the right, probably less important as the story they tell. And the story they tell is that in the current state of things, you really only see 10% or so of companies using generative AI tools. And yet if you scale out over 4 to 8 years and then over 8 to 11 years, you see that proportion of companies using tools like generative AI for their operations, for their work, scaling a lot closer to 50%. And so if you think out 10 years and think about the future of work on that horizon, you can expect that AI will be quite pervasive in the workplace on that time horizon, according to current predictions. The other dimension to look at it from is how roles and jobs are impacted, and what proportion of jobs out there in the marketplace are likely to require a lot of AI interaction. And you can see on that first column, there's a large balance of roles that have very little use or intentional exposure to AI today, and really only a very, very small percentage at the top, 8%, that may already be using AI in some capacity. If you look out over a time horizon in the future, the expectation is a 550% increase in that, scaling up to nearly 50% of roles having some level of AI exposure. And so where in education, we may have a degree of freedom and jurisdiction of our own to decide our use on AI, what is clear from studies like this, and there's many others, is that AI is going to impact the future of work. And in the workplace, you may not have a choice on whether you're interacting with it in some way at least. And I don't say that to create fear, just to create a realistic set of expectations on how we can expect things to evolve in industry. So moving forward, AI is in the workplace, but how is it being used? What does that look like? And I call out white collar here specifically because if you went back 10 or 20 years, you'd probably hear things said like, in the future, robots will do construction and robots will do this blue collar occupation. And the reality is, because of these tools being language-based, they're coming after white-collar jobs and impacting those professions much more so than they are the messy professions where you're out in the trenches, digging ditches, building buildings, and managing those more complex sets of scenarios. So what's happening in the workplace? You'll see AI used for ideation, for generating content. I need a LinkedIn post to advertise for an upcoming event that I'm doing. Generate the structure of that post for me. Or you'll see summarization. And that summarization could take the form of very helpful real-world use cases. I have 2 contracts, an old contract, a new contract. What are the differences between them? And further, should I be worried about the differences in this new contract, or are they inconsequential and unsubstantial? A task that in the past may have required the use of a lawyer. Now perhaps AI can do an 80% job or a 90% job, and you're left with only the thornier questions. You'll also see task automation. I have a process in my business where I get an invoice and I need to do something else with that invoice and take it here or there. I want to automate that process and I want to have AI interpret that information, route it appropriately, and do things. You see a lot of technology tools coming and promising these kind of benefits to companies by automating work. And then a last example that's pertinent and important is putting AI features into your products. There's a lot of readers in this audience. There may be some writers in this audience. Perhaps you've heard of a tool called Grammarly. And Grammarly is a great example of a company that's now turning into an AI company. They offer writing tools, spell checking tools. You're writing a document, we'll help you make it better. Guess what they're using? They're using these AI models to improve your writing, bringing the insight that these tools can bring, and delivering their service in a better way because AI is now built in. And so that's a common use case as well, where you see products promising that they're enhanced by AI or powered by AI. You'll see that kind of thing come out. So, intellectual property is a big concern for companies. You think about a company that's innovative and that's building things or designing things. I need to make sure that if I have proprietary designs, those aren't fed into AI where they're now leaked out where others can use them, or a competitive advantage, right? And so that's something that companies in this space are certainly navigating and thinking deeply about. A bit of a concern area that's less on the moral framework and more on the commercial side of things. And you can expect, as I've kind of painted this picture, that AI exposure will grow as an expectation. Today, if you start a professional role, you might be expected to know how to use tools like Word or Excel or PowerPoint. Over time, it may very well be the case that there's a level of expected AI proficiency for certain roles as you enter the workforce. And really here, to maybe summarize a bit, you can see the impacts of AI coming already in certain professions. I work in computer science and technology. There's been a strong push towards use of AI tools in software development and coding, and certainly that will continue, especially in some industries. But there's a reality there that as these tools come in and as they roll out more and more, thinking, reasoning, and the ability to assess and guide the tool is a skill that paradoxically will only grow in value. Being able to guide and use AI requires you to think critically, requires you to separate fact from fiction, and those are skills that certainly are only going to continue. We'll skip over the statistic, but the MIT has a Project Iceberg study that certainly brings a lot of focus to this as well. So a lot of adoption, a lot of potential for transformation in the workplace, and certainly something that you can expect you or your children to run into as these tools continue to roll out. Moving to our last use case, and really here we took two terms and mashed them together a bit, guidance and connection. And maybe a way to think about this is more personal uses of AI. We've talked about education, we've talked about the business world. Now what about as an individual? How are these tools being used by individuals? And this is an area where perhaps we ought to have more sanctified concern and sanctified skepticism around the value and use of these tools for these types of use cases. And think about the generation that I and others like me grew up in, right? Where you had maybe early on no access to the internet, and then you had access to dial-up internet. And really that idea of the internet as a place you go and connectivity as a thing you intentionally would seek out in certain contexts was our norm. Kids growing up these days, and this isn't just kids, it's others as well, have a degree of access to AI at all times. And that certainly brings some very interesting implications in when you think about these tools in terms of guidance and connection. Because really the use of these tools is often not going to be the simple, easy questions that Google could have answered. It's going to start to tiptoe into the thornier types of use cases where I'm seeking advice, I'm seeking counsel, I'm seeking situational guidance. So a couple different example use cases here, right? You see AI used personally for someone who's looking for advice. And this could be as simple as, I have a used car. Do I keep investing in it? Do I try and repair it, or should I sell it? People might turn to AI for a question like that. It's a general kind of advice. Or what strategies should I consider for retirement, right? Very often you'll see folks interface with tools like this and seek broad advice. But it can get deeper. It can become very situational. Here's a specific situation I have with my significant other, with my boyfriend, with my girlfriend. AI, give me counsel on that situation. And you see tools used like this. And a third category, which surprisingly, by a recent study I saw around ChatGPT usage, nearly 10% of AI traffic falls into this category. Someone isn't even asking AI a question or asking it to do something, it's just sharing information. And AI is serving as a listening ear in hearing what's being said, perhaps affirming that person and their feelings, And that's a very common emerging use case that these see these tools starting to do, where it just becomes a sounding board that's giving you feedback and leaning in. And you can see in this realm of guidance and connection a blend or a spectrum of use cases, some quite unproblematic, others quite concerning, and certainly an area where a lot of sanctified wisdom is required in self-examination or as a parent supervision around right and improper use of these tools. And as we look ahead, it's interesting to reflect. I don't have the answer to this, but it's interesting to reflect and think, what impacts might we start to see in society as this becomes the emotional support system for our society and people turning to tools like this. And double-clicking on that idea a bit more in our parting slide here, the idea of companion AI is an idea that maybe merits a special caution. If you follow Protect Young Eyes, you've seen recent articles, recent headlines around this idea of companion AI, especially if you have young children and you don't follow Protect Young Eyes, would highly recommend them. But companion AI refers to a type of platforms, conversational AI, that's aimed at being your friend. And you'll see marketing like what's shown here. This is a platform called Replica, and the way they market themselves is, we're the AI companion that cares. And think about how that messaging might connect to a vulnerable teenager, to someone with friendship challenges or relational challenges. Certainly a strong value proposition that someone might feel who's in that scenario. These platforms really are deeply concerning, should be deeply concerning to us as Christians, and should have a degree of deep caution associated to them. I don't say that to be alarmist. I just say that because of a few specific practical implications. Because you think about interacting with a digital friend versus an analog real-life friend, it creates very unrealistic expectations around what a friend might be. You could wake up at 2 in the morning every single day and message your AI companion, and it will never say no. It will never push back on you. It will never tell you you're wrong. It will affirm you. It will welcome you. It will create that kind of atmosphere, which certainly is going to reinforce your use of it in that way. This is certainly also deeply counter to God's design for relationships. God's designed us to live in community. He's designed us to live in the family, in the church, in the school, in our communities abroad. And we need to be deeply cautious of tools that take community and take relationships and translate them into a different way. And finally, there's a significant worldview misalignment. The kind of advice you'll get, the kind of guidance you'll get from tools like this is going to be what an average cross-section of our society would tell you, not what a reformed biblical Christian friend would tell you. And so very deep caution in use of these tools. Really a way to think about this, and this is another quote from Derek Sherman, who Brendan mentioned earlier, we ought never think of connection, relationships as something that we outsource to tools. And then the final quote I'd put up here is just, when we think about relationships, major decisions, all of those things, we might think it's intuitive, we might think our children get this, but it becomes very important for them to know human first, relational, and certainly that's the mold that we want to look at these things through. So we're deeply past time, but I will wrap us up here with a summary slide. The hope through all of this content is that we've given you a sense of the technology, a sense of some principles, and a sense of how to look at these things with wisdom. We don't hope that you leave here with an alarmist perspective, but that you leave here with a balanced perspective, a degree of biblical ration caution, a way to think about AI that I think resonates well as a tool, right? Think about it like any other tool. If you were a builder, you might go purchase a nice saw, and that tool is optimized very specifically for certain jobs. If used for the wrong jobs, danger, caution, damage, all need to be considered. The other reason I like that analogy is you wouldn't take a tool and you wouldn't bring it to the kitchen table and set it there next to your children. It stays in the garage. And certainly when we think about our use of these tools, tools like AI, we need to keep their use in the proper place. We need to do so in a way that honors knowledge. What is it? Where did it come from? That knowledge that honors a sense of understanding and how these tools work, but also that's honored by biblical wisdom and guided by that as well. So you've heard two Christian perspectives on AI tonight from Brendan and I. The hope is that you leave here, you'll be emboldened to form your own perspective on AI. Read, do research, talk to others. These are thorny, important issues that affect all of us. We hope that you're invigorated to go and consider these matters further. Thanks for your time and attention. Thanks to the RFPA for the opportunity to speak.